all some context, about 5 or 6 years ago, I joined a national research project on the history of the women's suffrage movement in Canada. And this is a series that's edited by Veronica Strong-BOAG, who many of you know. And each book in this series covers a different region and is published by UBC Press. So you can see on that screenshot there, the link at the bottom takes you to the page where you can pre-order a copy of the book if you're interested. So tonight I'm going to start with a brief overview of suffrage in British Columbia before moving on to talk about the unique aspects of Vancouver's suffrage movement. And I really want to spend my time trying to convince you that the suffrage movement in British Columbia, while it shared some things with the rest of the country, it was quite unique in and of itself. So suffrage, or the right to vote, was one part of the first wave feminist movement that really began in the mid-19th century and extended into the first few decades of the 20th. And I will say that how you define that chronology as a historian depends on where you live. This is a global movement. It looks a little bit different everywhere you are in the world. In Canada, most historians have focused on the more well-known, middle-class, educated women, people you may have heard of or seen a Heritage Minute on. Flora MacDonald-Dennison, or probably the most famous of all, the author Nellie McClung. Now, most of these women that you may have heard of, were from Ontario or the prairies. And the result has been a story that the Canadian movement was well-mannered, was polite, was of interest only to middle class or upper class or maybe elite women, to the extent that historians paid attention to suffrage in this region of British Columbia. Really, we've been seen as a bit of a dull backwater, rather unimportant, maybe even a little bit boring. But my research shows that BC wasn't dull at all. Suffrage women here were louder and more politically complex than I think historians have given them credit for. So tonight I'm going to talk about three main things. Those are the next 3 bullet points on the slide. I'm going to start by talking about how British Columbia was the first province in Canada that attempted to pass legislation allowing white settler women to vote. Second, British Columbia was deeply influenced by the politics of socialism and organized labor. And Vancouver was the only city in Canada with an independent, working class suffrage movement. Finally, BC was the only province to put the question of women's voting to a referendum, a public referendum, in the fall of 1916. And I could probably do a whole talk just on the suffrage referendum, but I'm only going to give it a couple of minutes at the end. So let's start with the first point. One thing that I'm often asked when I give a talk on the history of suffrage is, when did women in BC get the right to vote? And this is a tough question to answer. There is no one precise date I can give you. I really don't think that the right to vote is something that was won in a single moment. It is a right that existed in a matrix of constantly changing regulations and exclusions. Exclusions on the basis of gender, race, but also residency, property, job and military status, religion, marital status. The list really goes on. British Columbia had the longest lasting racial restrictions on the provincial vote, because I will mention here that your right to vote also is different depending on whether you're talking municipal, school board, provincial, or federal. It's a pretty complicated story. These sets of racial restrictions that I put up here remind us how deeply British Columbia imagined itself as a white settler society. As you can see from the list up here, Chinese, South Asian, and Japanese Canadians and First Nations were formally disenfranchised until the late 1940s. And really, it took many years of resistance and community activism, a world war, and an emergent human rights discourse to make legislative change. And that is actually something I talk about in more detail in the last chapter of my book, if that's something that interests you. I put up this really lovely picture here of Vancouver teacher Hideko Theodo, who was a member of the Japanese Canadian Citizens League. The group traveled to Ottawa in 1936 to lobby the federal government for the federal vote. And I think this is a really evocative image because it tells us this community activism. Really, it started in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it extends all the way into the 1940s. The first attempt in Canada to formally add settler women to franchise legislation came just after BC entered Confederation. In the 1870s, a small group of male politicians embraced the idea that a larger settler franchise, one which included women, made a nation both modern and civilized. And that was the language that they used. The earliest male supporter was Scottish-born MLA William Fraser Tolmie, and that's who you can see right there in the middle of that slide with his family. Tolmie emigrated to North America to work for the Hudson's Bay Company in the 1830s fur trade. And he ended up living in Victoria with his Métis wife, Jane Work, and their 12 children. In 1875, Tolmie became the first politician in Canada to introduce a motion to add the words, "every person, male or female," in the provincial voters' bill. So he was the first, but he was followed in the 1880s and the 1890s by other like-minded male politicians. I've just put a few of their photos up here for you to look at. I won't talk about them. All of these men believed that white settler women should be part of a forward-thinking and hopefully a prosperous province. And they usually believed that such women would help diminish the corruption of male-dominated politics. And this belief that white women in particular were of elevated moral status was a common belief that was held at the time. It was shared by both men and by women. By the 1880s and 1890s, these men were making alliances with newly formed women's organizations, groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union or the local councils of women. This is an image, we don't have a lot of photographs, sadly, of suffragists in British Columbia. This is a shot of the local council of women, the Victoria Council, standing on the steps of the legislature, probably after they'd been inside to watch a petition given to the legislature on their behalf. Women's groups, this is how women's groups worked at the time. They persuaded their male allies to introduce petitions and private members' bills on their behalf. And obviously they're not allowed to present them for themselves. So they would generally go and sit in the gallery and clap, sometimes boo, sometimes interject with some disrespectful remarks if they didn't like what they were hearing from the floor. There were 16 such private members' bills introduced in British Columbia between 1875 and 1916. All of them failed. Suffrage support peaked in 1902 when about 45% of MLAs voted in its favor. But with the development of partisan politics and the election of anti-suffrage conservative Premier Richard McBride, who you can see up here on the screen, in 1903, opposition hardened, and 80% of politicians remained opposed to suffrage. until 1916. And I put this cartoon up here as well because McBride, Premier McBride, really was the biggest nemesis for suffragists in British Columbia. They thought he was haughty, that he was difficult to work with, that he was disrespectful, that he was ignorant. And so this cartoon from the Vancouver Sun, I think, kind of captures how many suffragists saw him. Like McBride, most politicians believed that enfranchised women would dominate politics, steal male jobs, destroy marriages, and turn women into men and men into women. Some, like Cowichan MLA James Mutter, thought women were too stupid to vote. So he told the legislature in 1898 that, quote, "It was a scientific fact that the brain of a woman was 2 ounces lighter than that of a man," end quote. If you're interested in some of the anti-suffrage propaganda, much of it was produced in Great Britain. This is just one example, but you can go on to Google Images and do a search, and hundreds of these will come up. And I think this image kind of gives you a sense of the way in which anti-suffragists imagined that social disorder would come if women were enfranchised. Now, despite this opposition, suffragists in British Columbia actually came close to victory in 1899. That year, Nanaimo MLA and suffrage supporter Ralph Smith, who you see up here on your screen, introduced a private member's bill that lost by only 1 vote on second reading. Smith, you may know about Ralph Smith. He's a former coal miner, labor leader. He's pictured here next to his wife, Mary Ellen Smith, who I'll come back to in a moment, who was a leading suffragist and later elected the first female MLA in British Columbia. This 1899 loss was truly heartbreaking because the next day, an MLA admitted that he'd accidentally voted against the motion. So he'd meant to put his hand up with the yeas and he put it up with the nays. This very close vote inspired an outpouring of public opinion in many provincial newspapers. The Times columnist concluded that this attempt to franchise women was dangerous and revolutionary because it risked allowing women to replace men in all walks of life. So I'm going to end that first section on the cusp of the 20th century, and we're going to move into the next decade of activism as we shift into talking about Vancouver. So this failure in 1899 and the many other failures, both just before and just after, led to an increased sense of frustration amongst suffragists. And over the next 10 years, between sort of 1900 and 1910, the movement changed substantially. An independent suffrage movement was born in British Columbia. So women kind of took the issue of suffrage out of the reform organizations and created their own groups. And this happened alongside a shift in leadership from women in Victoria, who were the earliest activists, to women in Vancouver. To understand what made Vancouver's movement so unique, we need to start in 1910, which was the year that suffragists decided they had one last chance to get suffrage, and they needed to organize an independent movement led solely by women. So what they imagined was a new suffrage organization that men could join and support, but they couldn't hold an executive role and they couldn't lead. Under the leadership of Methodist social reformer Maria Grant, who you see up here on the screen, that first image, the Political Equality League was born. It was founded in Victoria in December 1910. About 70 men and women attended, including Martha Douglas Harris, the youngest daughter of former Governor James Douglas, and future Liberal Premier Harlan Brewster. And Harlan Brewster really was a pro-suffrage politician, and he was actually the close friend of the woman next to him on the screen, Victoria suffragist Cecilia Spofford. The two actually attended the same Baptist church in Victoria. The next month, Grant traveled to Vancouver to help Methodist social gospel reformer Florence Hall set up a Vancouver branch. Both Florence and her husband, William Lashley Hall, had deep roots in the Salvation Army and were very supportive of suffrage, as well as a whole host of other reforms that they believed would improve the status of women. These two cities, Victoria and Vancouver, were the nucleus of the provincial PEL, Political Equality League. And that organization really grew in scope quite quickly. It hired paid organizers, Florence Hall was one of them, to tour the province and establish groups across the Lower Mainland and the interior. And you can see this very basic map that I've put up here, just to give you a sense that within a couple of years, this organization had branches across the province. The ones in the interior were actually quite well attended and popular, especially Kelowna, Revelstoke, Greenwood, Summerland. They pop up quite a lot in the local newspapers. But as Vancouver grew in size and in economic power, tensions between suffragists in these two cities developed. Leadership slowly shifted from an older generation of middle-class women, so people kind of like Maria Grant, who were mostly located in Victoria, to a newer generation of Vancouver women. Many of these women in Vancouver had worked for pay and been active in the American or the British suffrage movement. As the conflict between the two cities grew, the Vancouver branch declared autonomy and renamed itself the Pioneer Political Equality League. So they've separated from the main organization. Many other splits would follow for all sorts of reasons, but this was the first big one. And it set the stage for the Vancouver movement, one in which working class and socialist women were deeply involved and took on positions of leadership and power. Now, I don't want to suggest there weren't many well-known middle class and upper middle class women involved in suffrage in Vancouver. There were, of course, just as there were elsewhere in the country. Probably the most famous would be a woman like Helen Gregory McGill, who a lot of people have heard about. But Vancouver really was the only city in the country, and one of the few in North America, with a suffrage organization dedicated to the needs of working class women and run by a working woman herself, Helena Gutteridge. And you can see this image of Helena Gutteridge on your screen, taken in 1911. The backdrop to this shift was the issue of women's paid labor, which was increasingly a matter of debate around the turn of the century. And really by 1910, the year the Political Equality League is formed, most suffragists believe that well-paid work is necessary for equality, because without it, women were dependent on marriage for protection and support. And by this time, most suffragists really resent the feeling that they need to be dependent on a husband. It makes them, they say, feel like they're treated as children. Census data shows us that many Vancouver suffragists came from a working class background, were married to skilled working class men, so printers, carpenters, machinists, or had themselves worked as stenographers, nurses, teachers, in some cases, journalists or writers. White women in British Columbia had comparatively high rates of paid labor after marriage, as well as high rates of self-employment, comparatively speaking to women elsewhere in the country. So the stage in Vancouver was set for a working class movement, but it came into being because of two factors. First, that all-important Declaration of Autonomy by the Pioneer League. And second, the vision of one of the city's leading suffragists, Helena Gutteridge. So she makes her first move in 1913 by establishing the Evening Work Committee. This is really sort of a caucus of the Pioneer League, and it attracted over 100 working women each week to meetings that were held at the Labour Temple in downtown Vancouver, and that's the building that was owned by the Vancouver Trades and Labour Council. Many of you might be familiar with Gutteridge. There is a plaza named after her now at City Hall. Gutteridge was a British-born suffragette and a member of the militant Women's Social and Political Union. She was a skilled tailor who immigrated to Vancouver in 1911, where she soon joined a number of women's groups, her local union, and the Vancouver Trades and Labour Council. Later on in life, in the 1930s, she became involved in the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, and was elected Vancouver's first woman city councillor in 1937. And that's what that image is there. And I love that picture from that photograph from the Vancouver Public Library, because it shows her surrounded by men. But Gutteridge acted together with other women, a number of other Vancouver women who were sympathetic both to organized labor and to socialism. One of her closest friends was American-born Susie Lane Clark. That image at the top is a picture of Helena and Susie. Clark had trained as a teacher, was married to a skilled printer, and also later ran for office under the CCF banner. Both of these women worked closely with Bertha Merrill Burns. Bertha Merrill Burns was a founding member of the two leading socialist parties of the time, the Socialist Party of Canada and the Social Democratic Party of Canada. And Merrill Burns was a journalist. She also operated a boarding house for a number of years in Nelson before she moved to Vancouver. She wrote columns for the socialist paper, the Western Clarion, and was married to Marxist British labor organizer Ernest Burns. And those images, the image on the bottom is a photograph from the Social Democratic Party picnic in North Vancouver. And then the circular photo, I've just zoomed in on Bertha herself. Believe it or not, that's the only image I've ever been able to find of Bertha Merrill Burns. It's not a great one, but it gives you a sense of what she looked like. And just below her is Ernest Burns. The Evening Work Committee was so popular that by the summer of 1913, it too separated from the Pioneer League. So it moves away from being a caucus and it branches into two sister organizations. The first was the BC Women's Suffrage League, the WSL, of which Gutteridge was the president. And the WSL really styled itself as a league for working class women, interested in all issues affecting women, the vote, and labor market issues. At the same time, Susie Lane Clark organized the Mount Pleasant Women's Suffrage League at the home of socialist Louisa Parr. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of Parr. While this league was open to women of all classes, it focused on women in the largely working class neighborhood and boasted a contingent of active socialist members. I'm not going to talk about them, all of them. I've got a couple of tables started. I just put their names up here just so you can see this range of women, the diversity of their political beliefs and their class backgrounds. What makes these leagues unique is how organizers tried to lift barriers to working women's participation in Vancouver. So for example, instead of daytime parlor meetings held in private homes, which was the sort of common way to organize at the time, they held open meetings on evenings and on weekends in public venues, mainly in the Labour Temple and in Lee Hall on Main Street in Vancouver. And remarkably for Vancouver, both of these buildings are still standing. Children were welcome to the meetings, an acknowledgement that most working women couldn't afford childcare. They held open air meetings on East Vancouver neighborhood streets while standing on soapboxes, not unlike Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park. They handed out pamphlets on street corners in downtown Vancouver and even entered a float in the Labor Day Parade in 1913. And sadly, I don't have a picture of that float. It's very, very hard to find images of the movement itself, particularly group photos or event photos. The only photograph in British Columbia that I've been able to find is this one. So I show it to you here just so you get a sense of what one of these floats might have looked like. This one was held at the same time, so it's a parade in Victoria in 1913. And you can see that at the front, women are on horseback holding up silver bugles, and it's pulling a float of women dressed in white robes. And then walking down the side of the street are the sons of the Political Equality League members decked out in suffragette colors. It's black and white, but I have a description of it elsewhere. So I know that they were wearing sashes of purple, green, and white. Now, these leagues were unique, not just because they accommodated the needs of working women, but because they explicitly stated that women were doubly oppressed. They were disenfranchised as women on the basis of their gender, and by capitalism, which exploited women's labor both in and outside of the home. Now, what's missing from their analysis around class and gender is very clear, but what's missing, of course, is race. Despite suffrage support from African Canadian women in both Victoria and Vancouver, and despite Indigenous women's activism centering the needs of women and children that's happening in women's auxiliaries in the province at the same time. No mainstream suffrage group, whether they were middle class or working class, made any attempt to address racism or colonialism or to reach out to racialized women. What these leagues in Vancouver did do was discuss the destructive impact of low wages and the high cost of living on women and families. And they talked quite openly about really tough issues, like how poverty forced women to give their children into institutional care, or how low wages contributed to the necessity of sex work. The Women's Suffrage League encouraged working women to act collectively to improve their own conditions of labor and of life, rather than allowing men or women of any class to define solutions to their problems. Now, these leagues in Vancouver, one of the first things that they did in 1913 was reach out to union leaders and socialist parties for their support. Gutteridge and Burns, for example, had a close, but I would also say conflicted relationship with socialist labor leader Parm Pettipies, who you see up here on the screen. Pettipies once owned the socialist paper The Clarion, the paper that Bertha Burns wrote for. He hired her to write a women's column, but later canceled it, probably, at least she believed anyway, because she was outspoken and critical about the failures of socialist male leadership, particularly what she thought was their failure to support women's suffrage. Pettipies later edited The Federationist, the newspaper of the BC Federation of Labour, and he gave his friend Helena Gutteridge a regular suffrage column there. In fact, the title for my book comes from one of her columns in that paper, in which she told her readers that, to her mind, both the women's movement and the labor movement were, quote, the expression of a great revolutionary wave that is passing over the whole world, end quote. And she really didn't ever want to choose between the two. She thought they were both equally important. These leagues were important because more mainstream suffragists tended to speak for, not listen to, or amplify the voices of actual working women. And middle-class women were often uncomfortable about talking about the failures of capitalism and rarely supported labor organizing or strike action by either men or women. Yet, organized labor and socialist parties weren't exactly comfortable for feminist women either. They prioritized male workers, assumed that working women would prefer to remain housewives, and fought for a male family wage, so a wage that would be high enough to keep a woman at home dependent on her husband. The Socialist Party of Canada had individual men who were members who supported suffrage and who were very much allies when they were elected to the legislature. People like this man, and I'm sorry, it's the only image I have of him, so it's not great quality. People like James Hawthorne-Waite, for example. Hawthorne-Waite was a great suffrage ally, introduced several private members' bills when he was sitting. But the official party platform of the Socialist Party opposed suffrage because it was seen as a diversion from the primary goal of abolishing capitalism. So the idea was that women could wait, or at least should wait, until capitalism was abolished before their equality could or would be achieved. This stance really infuriated quite a few women, including women like Bertha Merrill Burns, who insisted that there were two equally important wars to fight: a class war to end the exploitation of capitalism, and a sex war to end women's subordination. I just give you that one example, but there really are many more. Finally, I do think it's important to say that while these leagues in Vancouver had a unique focus, they were still integrated into the larger Vancouver suffrage community. Members crossed back and forth across class and ideological lines. And even when they disagreed, they worked together closely, building coalitions around shared goals. And I will say that suffragists really did disagree with each other all the time on everything from whether capitalism could be reformed, regulated, or abolished, to whether or not more radical tactics and direct action was needed to win the vote. So I'm just going to give you one example of how women in Vancouver so carefully and thoughtfully joined forces and worked together for a shared goal. In the summer of 1913, Catholic priest Father William O'Boyle delivered a sermon at Vancouver's Holy Rosary Church. In that sermon, he denounced suffrage as destructive. He also denounced socialism as destructive at exactly the same time. He accused modern women of rejecting the ideal feminine virtues embodied in the Virgin Mary, whom he described as, and I will say this is a bit ahistorical, an obedient and content housewife. O'Boyle got quite a bit of media coverage at the time, and suffragists across Vancouver and Victoria were furious. But pushing back was a sensitive issue. Most suffragists were Protestant, and many of them were aware of anti-Catholic feeling in Canada and didn't necessarily want to contribute to that. So it was Catholic suffragist Ida Douglas-FEARN, pictured up here. That's a photo of her when she's younger and training as a midwife in Great Britain. She lived in New Westminster. And it was Ida Douglas-FEARN who ultimately spearheaded a campaign to force O'Boyle to retract his views and apologize. He refused to apologize. So she turned to her friends, Helena Gutteridge and Susie Lane Clark. And together, they challenged O'Boyle to a public debate. He remarkably agreed to this public debate, and then they had to figure out who would debate him. And they managed to convince Mary Ellen Smith to take on the task. So pulling together all the resources of the Pioneer Political Equality League and the Women's Suffrage League led by Gutteridge, they rented the auditorium of the Labour Temple. And in November 1913, Smith and O'Boyle met on its stage to an overflowing audience with hundreds of spectators. And the newspaper descriptions say that there were people standing in the aisles, sitting on the floor, a very enthusiastic crowd. O'Boyle never did change his mind. He actually joked that he was the villain who, in his words, put the man in emancipation. But Smith used both humor and facts about women's subordination to rouse the interest of the audience. She called Boyle a brilliant young man who was probably not old enough to hold an informed position on suffrage or on women. He wasn't that young, he was 38, but apparently he had some youthful charm, and it's something that Mary Ellen Smith played with a lot when she was on stage. This is just one example. There were hundreds of such events, both large, like this one, and small, in Vancouver at this time. One single debate might not have changed someone's mind, but events like this increased media coverage, showed how women could work together across some differences, and demonstrated that suffragists could confront anti-suffrage men in public, really take them on. This pattern of deliberate coalition politics, which was forged so deeply in Vancouver, helped lay the groundwork for the successful suffrage referendum of 1916. So I'm going to turn to that now and end just very briefly telling you about that moment in time. So the provincial vote came to the majority of women in the province, white settler women, in 1917. But it did not come in the way that suffragists had hoped. The First World War slowed suffrage referendum. It's really kind of taking off in 1913, 1914 hits, and everything slows down. But it was revived by the political troubles of the Conservative Party and the resignation of their nemesis, Premier McBride, in 1915. So suffragists really hoped that they could push his replacement, William Bowser, to just pass a suffrage bill enfranchising women. But Bowser turned the tables and promised legislation only if it were approved by the majority of the male electorate in a referendum. And he scheduled the referendum alongside the September 1916 general election. Now, as you can imagine, most suffragists were furiously opposed, seeing a referendum as anti-democratic, because of course only men would get to vote. And there was a lot of conflict over how to respond. Some refused to campaign for the referendum on the basis of principle. Others threw their energy behind electing the Liberals. Some remained defiantly nonpartisan. So Helena Gutteridge, for example, was suspicious of all parties. She didn't even join a political party until she joined the CCF in the 1930s. She said that one party was as bad or as good as the other. In the end, most put aside their differences and formed a united coalition called the Suffrage Referendum Association, which was headquartered in downtown Vancouver. The association brought together men and women and actually allowed men to take on leadership roles. It brought together Catholics, Jews, and Protestants in the city to spend the summer campaigning relentlessly to get the referendum passed. It remained officially nonpartisan and worked with conservatives, socialists, and liberals as much as it could. As referendum day approached, the SRA, the association, trained hundreds of women in election procedures and trained them to act as scrutineers at polling booths. And so this image at the bottom, which again is taken from a newspaper, so it's not of great quality, but I really like it because it's an image of a team of scrutineers in New Westminster, sort of proudly posing for a portrait for the local newspaper. In an era without opinion polls, it was really hard to predict the outcome. Opposition persisted into 1916, and really most disappointingly, the BC Federation of Labour withdrew support in 1916, telling union members in an editorial column in the Federationist that women were stealing men's jobs during the war. And this was a really huge disappointment to women like Gutteridge and Bertha Merrill Burns. But in the end, the results were pretty clear. About 70% voted in favor of suffrage, with high levels of support in Vancouver. And suffragists were quite happy with the results, although they were angry with ongoing delays in counting the overseas soldier ballots. There was quite a few charges of corruption in the process. So suffragists had been hoping they could vote right away, but it was dragged out for several months. Finally, the Liberals, who were elected in that fall, passed a bill giving women the franchise and the right to vote for office on the same terms as men on the 5th of April, 1917. So this is the date that, to return to that for one of those first questions, this is the date that people often give when answering the question, when did women in British Columbia get the right to vote? But the legislation fell short in a number of ways. It didn't give women the federal vote, and they really wanted to vote in the upcoming federal election, an important election on the wartime government of Robert Borden. Former suffragists also really struggled in the 1920s and the 1930s to figure out how best to use their political power. Should they just join the mainstream parties? Should they join third parties like the CCF? Maybe they should stay out of partisan politics altogether and try to get independents elected to office. Some even debated what it would mean to create a new party, a women's party that would bring women together to vote as a bloc. Regardless, women remained underrepresented in provincial politics until the late 20th century. And finally, to end back where we began, this legislation explicitly left racial restrictions in place until the late 1940s, restrictions that were only removed after the Second World War. So in conclusion, even just a short journey into these stories of suffrage in British Columbia and in Vancouver reveal a movement dealing with tough issues that are still relevant today. The relationship between economic and political inequality, the refusal to deal with deep and systemic racism, the underrepresentation of women in electoral politics. These are all issues that are still with us today. I think you can see that the movement had many failures, but hopefully also that the women who built it were more complex, noisier, louder, perhaps even a bit more interesting than they have been remembered. Thank you.
Maybe I can just start off with a question. I was intrigued to find out in some research that I was doing how involved Mary Ellen Smith was with the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire.
Yeah.
And then the role that they played with the federal vote. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, that imperialist settler woman who is supporting the war but is nevertheless a suffragist, and how that worked?
Yeah, so yeah, and Mary Ellen Smith is such a great example of that kind of suffragist, and there were many like her. You know, Mary Ellen Smith and Ralph Smith both were strong supporters of women's suffrage, but also strong supporters of restricting Asian immigration to Canada, and that was a value that was shared across, you know, was shared by members of the Socialist Party, it was shared by many churches, it was shared by many suffrage groups. I think that women in British Columbia too, one thing, so that anti-Asian racism did not surprise me. I think we all know how powerful that was and how powerful it remains in British Columbia. One of the things that did surprise me though was in British Columbia how many white settler women were incredibly xenophobic regarding Eastern European immigration and Southern European immigration. And BC never received quite as many immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe as did, say, Alberta or other parts of the prairies, but it was something that really bothered them. So a lot of suffragists really spoke against male immigration from those places in Europe. They spoke openly about how these men did not hold British values, couldn't speak English, and yet they still had the right to vote. And this really bothered white women in particular. So that xenophobia begins in that it's in the 1880s. Maria Grant writes that in her columns in the 1880s for the Victoria Daily Times, and it persists right up until 1916. So it's a very, very strong thread in British Columbia. Yeah, that's a great question.
From Eric Martin, thanks for the wonderful talk, Lara. Bob would have loved it. Do you have any ideas on why there are so few photographs of suffragists in the BC context?
Oh, that's such a good question. It was one of the most frustrating things about this project, the lack of photographs. It was something that I was actually on a panel, a Zoom panel the other day, and all the other authors in the series had the same frustration as well. There just aren't that many. It's hard to know. I know that there were photographs because sometimes in local newspapers, they refer to photographs that were taken at an event, but the newspapers never published them. And those photographs don't seem to have been donated to an archive. It doesn't mean they don't exist. Maybe they're buried here and there. But I searched high and low. It was really hard to find images. I was very disappointed that Florence Hall, for example, who was quite well known in Vancouver and who lived in many places in British Columbia because her husband moved quite a lot for the Methodist Church, there is not one single photograph of her anywhere that I can find. I found out where she was buried in the cemetery in North Vancouver, and I went to see if I could at least get a picture of her headstone, but either she never had one or it was removed. So we found the plot where she was buried, but there was no grave marker, and that was disappointing as well. I wonder if maybe people didn't think these photographs were of value. They were just images taken by women and their friends, and so they never got donated to an archive. The other thing that's missing too all of these organizations kept extensive minutes, but we don't have any minutes from a suffrage group. We have local Council of Women minutes and WCTU minutes, but no minutes from any of these suffrage groups anywhere in the province that I've seen yet. So perhaps they got thrown away. It's just really hard to know.
In terms of the newspapers of the time, that even though the half-tone photograph was developed in the 1880s, that they were very, very expensive to reproduce, and they were very coarse. The screens were very, very coarse. So even photographs of people, which is why you get so many line drawing illustrations in newspapers, if you get anything like that at all, and they tend to come out from there. And then I believe the speed graphic camera wasn't developed until the 1930s, and that kind of portable camera began to revolutionize that. But I remember this 30, 35, 40 years ago, wondering why there were so few photographs of, for example, Chinatown. Now it's turned out that there were more than what went into archives, but it's just wasn't what people photographed at that time, or the people who had cameras didn't go out and photograph it.
What's the subject of study, really? So, yeah.
From Donna Jean McKinnon, thank you. That was fascinating and illuminating. I've always had a hard time figuring out how to untangle all the different local suffrage groups and their affiliations. I'm particularly interested in the Mount Pleasant Suffrage League. I'm going to buy your book. But could you talk about some of the sources of your info about the Mount Pleasant League? So,
yeah, a lot of you know Jolene Cumming, and she has done a fair bit of work on the Mount Pleasant Suffrage League, and so I knew about it through her. And I had the names of some of the leading women, so people like Susie Lane Clark. And really what helped this project immensely was the fact that so many BC newspapers are now digitized. And I just don't think I could have done this project 10 years ago or 15 years ago to the same extent. It would have taken maybe 20 years. So once I collected the names of 10 or 12 or 13 women, I could then do a name search on the database at newspapers.com or the open historical newspapers through UBC. And then I could see the names of all the other women, because even though there weren't a lot of photographs, one thing that a lot of newspapers did, like for example, the Vancouver Daily World, which had a suffrage column written by Susie Lane Clark, it would list the names of all the women who showed up to the meetings, just a really, really, really long list. And with all the different spellings, you know, because they spelled the name differently every time. And so then you could take that list of 20 or 30 names and find 10, 12, or 15 more people. And that's really how I found out more about the Mount Pleasant Suffrage League. And there were quite, you know, a woman like, who didn't really talk about, but Nora Tuddy was a member of the Mount Pleasant Suffrage League, and Nora was a member of the Social Democratic Party of Canada. She defined as a Marxist. She wrote columns that implored women to break the chains of oppression. And those are women that they pop up here and there in these local newspapers, like the Vancouver Daily World, but they don't show up elsewhere. So you really have to collect their names and then search for them in every venue that you can. From Janet Nickel, did the war create a sense of guilt among suffragists as they campaigned in 1916 on the referendum? They did debate it. You know, when McBride resigned, the suffragists from Vancouver, and actually from all the leagues across the province, met. They had a series of meetings in Vancouver and also in Victoria, and their plan was to kind of guilt Bowser into giving them the vote. So their argument was, listen, there's a war on. We're busy supporting war work. This goes back to your first question about imperialism and patriotism. Many women, Gutteridge was critical of the war. Florence Hall was critical of the war as well. But many ultimately went on to support at least the soldiers, to be involved in support work for soldiers, particularly through the Red Cross. So they had hoped to guilt Bowser into giving them the vote. And when he didn't, there was some debate within suffrage communities, should we continue? Should we continue to fight? And Mary Ellen Smith actually writes, she gives a speech, I think, and it's reprinted in one of the newspapers of the time, in which she says, absolutely we should. I support the war effort, but that means nothing if women don't have the right to vote, so I'm going to continue fighting for it. So there is some evidence, too, that as women met together to, say, knit for soldiers or to raise money for soldiers, that they were debating the war. That pops up a little bit. You get a sense that they were meeting together and they were calling it a voluntary group to support the war effort, but they were actually also talking about the suffrage movement. I don't have firm evidence that's true, but it's kind of hinted. So they actually tried to play on Bowser's guilt, and it didn't work.
Can you tell us a little more about the life of Helena Gutteridge?
Oh, sure. She's so fascinating, and she's the subject. Some of you may have read the biography of Helena Gutteridge by Irene Howard, which is really wonderful. It's a great biography, and it places her life in context. We don't know a huge amount about her life. She grew up working class in London. She worked as a tailor in London. We do know that she was a member of the WSPU, so that they're the very militant suffragette movement, the suffragettes who marched in mass protests and who committed some property damage, window breaking, and arson. There is some rumor that the WSPU sent Helena Gutteridge to Canada specifically to get a branch of the WSPU going. It's hard to know if that's true. Maybe it was true. I don't really know. But one of the most remarkable things I think about Helena Gutteridge is that she really had a finger in everything in Vancouver. She was involved in more traditional women's groups. She was involved in labor organizing. She tried to organize laundry workers in Vancouver. She testified to a royal commission. She advocated for the minimum wage. She was really everywhere. And she built a lot of friendships. So maybe a sad thing about Helena is that she was a very close friend of Ida Douglas-FEARN, the woman who took on Father O'Boyle. They were great friends. And at some point, Ida's son, Ollie, came home from the First World War, and Helena and Ollie married. And we don't really know anything about their story. She moved out of Vancouver for a while. They raised chickens on a farm, and then they divorced. And sometime in there, not only did her marriage fall apart, but her friendship with Ida fell apart as well. It seems like Ida did not want them to marry, and that destroyed their friendship. So yeah, Helena Gutteridge is one of those women who is so interesting. She tells us so many stories about the history of this city, about the labor movement, about the women's movement. When she's on city council in Vancouver, for example, she tries to get social housing going in Vancouver. Vancouver actually had property restrictions on the municipal vote until the 1950s to one degree or the other, and she tried to get those lifted as well. She's a really interesting character, and if you're interested, I would say definitely read Irene Howard's biography of her. Will tell you a lot, and she's got some great stories.
Thank you for that. And a final question from Joanne. How did they deal with mixed marriages? Could the women of white men vote?
Could the women of...
I'm not sure whether the question would be, could a white woman married to an Asian man vote?
Well, I know, certainly I know that the children, what's so interesting, it's a good question, because like so many of the restrictions on the vote, the story is so complicated. And it's really hard to tell who's allowed to vote and who's not allowed to vote at any given time at every level of government. And there's actually a great story, I think it's in Victoria, where, you know, the provincial government was constantly expanding and retracting the school board vote. And at a certain point, nobody even knew if women were allowed to vote at all. So they just turned up to the polls and they let them vote, even though they didn't actually, technically, they shouldn't have. So it's a complicated story. What's interesting, to move away from Vancouver, I guess, for just a moment, is that the children of people like William Fraser Tolmie and his wife Jane Work, these are children of Indigenous maternal heritage, and those children, those women in those families, some of them were suffragists. So people like Martha Douglas Harris, who in some ways are read and understood as white, but in other ways hold on a little bit to that maternal Indigenous heritage. May Fraser Tolmie, who's the daughter of William Fraser Tolmie, is a lifelong suffragist, actually. And so they fought for the right to vote, and they were allowed to vote because they weren't First Nations with Indian status. That's what prevented First Nations from voting. The other issue is that African Canadian men could vote in British Columbia, and the wives and the children of some of those men were early suffragists as well, sort of in the 1880s, in particular 1890s in Victoria. They're quite active in the reform and suffrage movement. But because of racism, those women really never saw the women's movement as the main vehicle for their liberation and their freedom. They worked within their own community organizations. So the racial restrictions are actually complex, and they're deeply tied to all the other restrictions on the vote that we've been talking about. I hope that answers at least part of your question. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Thank you.